The Colossal weapons is definitely the most unique and weirdest weapon category in the entire game. It feels like every single option on this list just differs greatly in terms of things like stance damage or motion values. Normally with all the weapon categories, they just tend to be very consistent in their options and how much stance damage they do, but not for the Colossal weapons. And also there's only 6 infusible ones out of 20, which to have this many unique options in one category is kind of unheard of. And somehow half of these options are still kind of useless and mediocre. Now the Colossal weapons tend to be very hard hitting but very slow, and out of all of these like big large strength weapons, I kind of like the Colossal weapons the least. I like things like Colossal swords, great axes, and great hammers a lot better because they typically don't get that much less damage, but they'll just either have much faster movesets, more weapon skill options, tend to be a lot lighter, and sometimes even get just as much stance damage too. Now Colossal weapons have been buffed plenty of times throughout the recent updates to where some of the movesets might be a bit quicker and feel a lot more consistent to use, but even then for some of these weapons it feel like they would just be better if they just were like a lot lighter and had a faster moveset. And in a game like this where enemies tend to be really fast, these slower types of weapons that have long animations and cost a lot of stamina might not be as effective with how fast some of these bosses tend to be, especially because you can get just as much stance damage with some of the other types of strength-based classes. But there are going to be a handful of really solid options that this class does have to offer, as we'll get into. But I do want you guys to know that this is probably going to be like the hardest weapon ranking that I'm going to be doing out of all the categories. So once again, don't really focus on too much how I rank them, but just focus more on what I'm actually saying about these weapons. Starting off at number 20, the Dragon GREATCLAW, which is one of the worst weapons in the entire game, and it is not just because of the fact that this thing doesn't get a unique skill, but the weapon itself is just trash as well. Like, it is really light and it does have low requirements for a Colossal weapon, but it just gets like the worst damage by far. Like, there are other weapons with similar requirements and similar weights that just straight up out damage this thing, even with the split damage that the Dragon GREATCLAW does have, because the scalings of this thing are just horrendous. It does get bonus damage to dragons, but it doesn't really mean much with its split lightning damage, and the fact that it doesn't get a unique moveset or anything. Also, this thing only gets standard damage as well. I don't know why this thing didn't get piercing damage, like it's literally called a claw. And also this thing gets the worst stance damage out of all the Colossal weapons as well. Typically, Colossal weapons will get around about 40 to 45 stance damage on their charged heavy attacks. This thing only getting 36, which is literally less than a hammer and worse than a heavy thrusting sword as well. But it doesn't even get a faster heavy attack. It gets the exact same speed as all the other ones and doesn't really get bonus damage to compensate. So yeah. The weapon itself is not good. But yeah, worst of all yet, it just gets stuck with Endure. Like, there are so many different types of lightning attacks that the Draconic Tree Sentinel actually has. Don't know why a single one wasn't put onto this weapon. Like, Endure is a perfectly fine skill. Probably wouldn't pair it alongside a Colossal weapon, but it's obviously not unique. Like, I can excuse why they didn't actually incorporate a unique skill for this thing in the base game, but the game's been out for like 2 years now, and the fact that they didn't actually add a single update to just throw a random skill onto this thing. Like, just reskin anything and then slap like a lightning skill onto it. Like, there are hundreds of mods out there that people probably designed in just one day just to give this thing a unique type of skill, and for some reason From Software just decided against it. Number 19, the Rotten Staff, which is another case of weapon that should just be having a different and unique type of skill, but this doesn't. The weapon actually does get some pretty decent range, has relatively low weight and lower requirements as well, but it does just get a regular strength scaling and cannot be infused, and its total damage is not going to be that high compared to basically all the other strength-based Colossal weapons. But the trade-off is that it does get passive rot build-up at 75 rot. Now the thing is, with a Colossal weapon, you're not going to be proccing rots that quickly at all. It's going to take many hits just to be able to proc rot. And honestly, Scarlet Rot is only going to be useful against bosses, and bosses typically just have very high rot resist. There are going to be much better things in this game that you can use to proc rot, and probably even a better version of rot because the weapons only get 16% rot buildup. One thing that would have been really nice to add onto this weapon would be a cool rot skill, because this thing is off the Putrid avatar, and these enemies get this cool like rotten slam AoE attack, but the skill for this weapon is just a regular holy based AoE. Like, it shares the exact same skill as the staff of the avatar. Like, there is literally no Scarlet Rot skills in the entirety of the base game. Thankfully, I actually did get some for the DLC. Like, it probably would have served nicely as like an early game option, but if it's like lower weight, the fact that it's a somber weapon. But no, you get this thing in the Haligtree. Number 18, the Rotten GREATAXE, which is one of the few infusible Colossal weapons. Now, this one is just like the rotten version of the Duelist GREATAXE, and I do prefer the Duelist GREATAXE a bit more, as I will get into, and I will break it down once I get to it. But the reason why I'm not going to value this weapon is the same reason why I'm not going to value the Rotten Staff very much, and that passive rot for a Colossal weapon doesn't really mean anything. The weapons are way too slow, and it's just going to take a long time to proc rot. Even with certain types of skills that can hit multiple times quickly, it's still not going to be that viable, and the time that you actually proc rot on a boss boss, you're better off just using a weapon that gets much higher damage, because this one does get the lowest damage out of all the infusible colossal weapons, and there are other summer-based ones that can just out damage this too. So if you wanted a weapon like this, I'd rather just go with the duelist GREATAXE, because you can just acquire that one earlier in the game, and it is basically the exact same version, but just with more damage and without the rot. Like if Scarlet Rot scaled off Arcane, I would like it a lot more, because you could go into an occult infusion and potentially proc rot a lot quicker. But no, unfortunately, you cannot, and there are plenty of rot sources in this game, as I mentioned, that could just proc rot way faster and way more consistent and just do more damage. Number 17, the Staff of the Avatar. Now, this weapon actually does get some of the most range in class, and actually does get some of the highest AR as well. This thing gets a really good strength and faith-based scaling, and it can get some very solid damage. Now, the thing is, it is split holy damage, and for the base game, having a high damaging holy weapon doesn't really equate to that higher damage, because a lot of enemies and a lot of bosses are very resist to this type. Now, that is until you get to the DLC, because there are a lot more holy weak bosses and enemies in this location. But in the DLC, you can acquire the Shadow Sunflower Blossom, which is another colossal weapon that gets very similar damage, actually gets a better faith scaling, gets the better moveset with that heavy attack, and it gets the more useful skill as well, because that one is actually unique. Whereas for the Staff of the Avatar, the weapon skill Erd Tree Slam is just a reskinned version of Golden Slam, and Golden Slam is literally better. Like, this skill does more damage and does more stance damage. I don't know why they just didn't put Golden Slam onto the skill, because it would have just made it for a better version, or maybe just make Erd Tree Slam just a better version of Golden Slam. Probably would have made it pretty useful. Like, the skill is still pretty decent. That's like a nice AoE slam, but if like the regular Ash of War version just outclasses it, I'm not going to value it much, especially if it's only going to be useful in the base game where holy damage isn't really that good. Number 16, the Troll's Hammer. Now, this weapon can be buffed, but unfortunately cannot be infused and still requires smithing stones, which it definitely is a downside, especially because it actually does only get stuck with Troll's Roar, which is not that bad of a skill. It does serve as a nice AoE, but unfortunately it's not unique, and you can put it on other weapons and just potentially get more damage. Now, this is a striking-based colossal weapon, so therefore it actually does get some of the higher amounts of stance damage. It also does get a pretty decent strength scaling and a little bit of a faith scaling, only a D in that, and does come alongside some split fire damage, and the fact that you can infuse it and it gets a faith scaling means you can go into a lot of faith and benefit off more weapon damage and some more spell buff damage. Using things like Electrify Armaments could just help you do a lot more damage to this weapon. Now, unfortunately, there is no spell fire buff in this game, like a traditional spell fire buff. Obviously, you have things like Blood Flame Blade and Black Flame Blade, but something like Electrify Armament, but just for the fire damage, that doesn't exist in this game for some reason. It did in the other games. Would have been nice if we had it in this one. It would make for a very nice pairing, because doing 3 different types of damage is not going to be ideal. So it could have had the use of being like a really high damaging strength faith based weapon with some split fire damage, which could be pretty useful. But yeah, it just kind of falls short of that, and at best, it's just like a decent damaging colossal weapon. Number 15, the Axe of Godfrey, which is definitely one of the most disappointing boss weapons in the entire game. This thing should be like the poster boy for strength, with like a fat S scaling and high amounts of stance damage, but no, it gets like the opposite of those things. It only gets a C scaling and strength, and it just gets pretty poor total AR. Like a lot of other colossal weapons can just straight up out damage this thing, and in terms of its stance damage, it only gets 36 stance damage with a charged heavy attack and 18 for a light attack, which is much less than all the other colossal weapons. Like, this is basically just as much as like a greatsword. Now, thankfully, it does have a skill that boosts the damage and boosts the strength scaling by a little bit. In Regal Roar, does do this nice AoE attack. Doesn't do like the most amount of damage, but the whole purpose is to just buff the weapon, which even with this buff, it's still not going to do as much damage as some of the other infusible colossal weapons. Now, the skill also does alter the heavy attacks. That does this cool stomping swipe, and actually can do some nice damage. You can pair it alongside the Raw Medallion and the Highland Axe, even the Shattered Stone Talisman, and it could output some decent amount of damage. Now, for how long of an animation this thing is, I would have liked for it to be a bit more, but the main reason why I would just never want to use this thing is because the stance damage is so bad. This entire stomping swipe attack does 30 stance damage. 30 stance damage. That is literally less than a straight sword heavy attack. Like, why is this massive colossal weapon combo doing such bad stance damage? I will never understand. And even worse yet, the follow-up heavy attack with that really insane charge does only 18 stance damage. Like, the uncharged version should be doing this much stance damage, not the fully charged versions. Like, this thing should at least be doing 50 stance damage, at the very least. Like, this attack is not that good. Like, it's a long animation. There needs to be like a risk-reward factor, but there just isn't one. This thing needed an S scaling in strength, and it needed way more stance damage. Number 14, the GREATCLAW. Now, if this weapon could be infused, it would literally be an S tier, like one of the best strength weapons in the entire game, but unfortunately, it cannot be. The thing does require smithing stones and can be buffed, but yeah, unfortunately, this cannot be infused. Does get a decent strength scaling. It actually doesn't weigh that much as well. Does get some split holy damage, so pairing it alongside some holy types of buffs could serve to be pretty nice. But obviously, as I mentioned, holy damage in the base game isn't really the greatest thing. And once you get to the DLC, there is going to be the existence of the Shadow Sunflower Blossom that could just potentially outclass this, because that weapon also gets the exact same heavy attack. Now, this downward slam heavy attack is definitely one of the best heavy attacks in the entire game. This thing is like quicker than a greatsword heavy attack, but it just does insane amounts of damage and does like 45 stance damage. So the optimal way to build around it would be in a charged heavy attack build, which would have been nice if it could be infused, so you could throw in things like Cragblade or Royal Knight's Resolve. But unfortunately, this thing only gets stuck with Golden Land, which is not a bad skill by any means. Does have the utility of being both like a sniper and an AoE attack, but this skill does scale off Faith, and this thing only gets like a descaling in Faith, so you're not really benefiting much there. But the total damage of the weapon is nice, the heavy attack is nice, it could carry you throughout like most of the base game. It's definitely not going to be a bad option, but there are just like better heavy attack builds out there, especially when you get to the DLC. Because this exact heavy attack exists on the Bloodfiend's arm, and that one can be infused, which obviously just makes it the better option. Number 13, the GOLEM'S Halberd, which this thing actually does have the most range out of all the infusible colossal weapons. Does get some pretty decent damage, doesn't get anywhere near as much as things like the Giant Crusher or the Prelate's INFERNO CROZIER, but it does outdamage things like the DUELIST GREATAXE and actually the GHIZA'S Greatsword, and it also weighs a bit less than the Greatsword as well. So if you wanted to slap on things like Lion's Claw, you could potentially just get a better version of it. Now, I definitely wouldn't prefer it over the GHIZA'S Greatsword by any means, because that weapon is obviously a colossal sword, meaning it's going to get the better and faster moveset and get access to poking attack skills, which is going to make it a lot more versatile. Now, this weapon actually does get some split piercing damage itself, as it does have access to the Charge Forth skill. And Charge Forth is a pretty decent skill to use against smaller enemies. It can stun lock them nicely. Now, the thing is, you can't infuse this weapon with Charge Forth. Like, I understand that's how the Ashes of War work in this game. Like, if it works with one weapon in the class, all the other weapons have to be able to use it as well. But they could have just tried to make like a special exception and have the Golem's Halberd be able to access certain types of poking skills like Giant Hunt or Charge Forth. Would have been really cool. Help us utilize the piercing damage that it does have. So it definitely feels like a missed opportunity there. Weapon also does get a unique heavy attack in this really cool horizontal swipe. Basically shares the same one as some of the great spears like this Serpent Hunter. And obviously you're just going to have more range and more damage with a weapon like this, and actually do a bit more stance damage as well. The charged heavies do about 40 stance damage, which unfortunately is still less than the other colossal weapons, as on average they'll do about 45 stance damage, but obviously this one is a bit quicker. So overall, the weapon does do some things pretty well. Like, it's decent damage for its weight. It does get an okay heavy attack, but it's still not going to be better than a lot of other things in my opinion. Like, if you wanted to go with a Lion's Claw build, I'd still use the GHIZA'S Greatsword. If you wanted to go with a colossal weapon charged heavy attack build, things like the Giant Crusher or Bloodfiend's Arm, they're also going to be better. And it also doesn't help the fact that this weapon has to be farmed as well, and it also is a very annoying farm at that. I feel like this weapon definitely could have had like a unique light attack combo that probably could have incorporated certain types of poking attacks, maybe having like a rolling poking attack or be able to use poking attack skills. Probably would have given it a lot more of a use, but unfortunately I can't put it higher than a B tier. Number 12, the DEVONIA'S Hammer. Now, this weapon is not bad by any means. In fact, it's actually pretty decent. But I'm just going to get it out of the way. The main reason why it is going to get into the B tier and not any higher is because it still is outclassed by the Ordovis's Greatsword. This weapon can be acquired early in the game. Obviously, is a Greatsword, which I typically do like better as a weapon class, but its skill is just going to be better in my opinion, as it can be charged up way faster and literally do more stance damage. I don't know why the Colossal weapon version gets less stance damage than the Greatsword version, but that is just the case. Now, that's not to say that the DEVONIA'S Hammer is useless by any means, because it still has a bunch of things going for it. It still gets a very decent strength faith-based scaling, so the total damage can be very nice. The skill actually can work with things like the Crucible armor set, whereas the Ordovis's Greatsword cannot, so it actually does get some more damage. And also the uncharged version does actually flatten smaller enemies to the ground and do 45 stance damage, where the uncharged version of the Ordovis's only does about 20 stance damage and doesn't have that flattening effect. But when you think about it, the uncharged version of the DEVONIA'S is basically just as long as the fully charged version of the Ordovis's, so it doesn't really make that big of a difference. I definitely feel like this weapon should have had like a different skill, not just like a reskinned version of the Ordovis's Greatsword. I would have found much more value in it. Like, it still does amazing damage. It still has like a wider AoE than Ordovis's, but the fact that it's getting less dance damage and has like such a long animation makes me not really like it, especially in like a 1v1 boss fight, because your charged heavy attacks are literally going to do more damage and more stance damage faster than you can with the weapon skill. Like, the weapon skill is going to be only there to like maybe just hit multiple enemies at once in like a nice AoE, but if you're fighting a boss 1v1, the charged heavy attacks are probably going to be better. And if you wanted a charged heavy attack build, there are going to be other weapons that you'll see in this list that are also strength and faith based related that can actually get more damage and a better heavy attack. Like, I don't think they're going to give this weapon like a brand new skill, which they should have. But if you're going to buff this thing, just let it have like 80 stance damage. Like, why not? It's such a long animation and you want to be able to separate it from the Ordovis's greatsword. So just let it have 80 stance damage. Fuck it. Number 11, the Shadow Sunflower Blossom, which is a very high damaging strength faith based option. Does get some very good range, does get a whole bunch of holy damage, which as I've been mentioning is not the best thing in the base game, but it definitely does perform very well in the DLC, which is where you actually acquire this weapon. It also does get the same heavy attack as the Great Club and the Bloodfiend's arm, which is one of the best heavy attacks in the entire game. Like, this attack can get a bit over 45 stance damage, which actually is the highest in just one hit. And it also is the quickest charged heavy attack that the Colossal weapons have too. Now, fortunately, this weapon actually does get a unique skill as well. Now, unfortunately, the skill performs very similar to the heavy attack, and that is like a bunch of these downward slams. Now, the skill does get some better stun locking potential because it does hit many times in quick succession, so maybe pairing it alongside the multi-hit talismans might make for a decent pairing. It does actually get you a bit more hyper armor as well, but the thing is the total damage and the total stance damage of this skill is still going to be less than the heavy attack. Like, the skill does have a little bit of an AoE, so it might be good in certain situations, but in most cases, if you're fighting like bosses in 1v1 fights or fighting like larger enemies, you're typically just going to be spamming the heavy attack the entire time. And if that's the case, you're just better off going with the Bloodfiend's arm. The Bloodfiend's arm gets the same heavy attack, but it actually does get a little bit of a bleed AoE aftershock effect, and this makes it do more stance damage for the exact same time, and this weapon can be infused. And if you put this with a faith-based infusion, it literally does more damage than the Shadow Sunflower Blossom. Like, exact same stats, which are basically unoptimized for the Bloodfiend's arm, it still outdamages it. And obviously the fact that the Bloodfiend's arm can be infused, you can slap on things like Cragblade or Royal Knight Resolve, and you're just gonna get way more damage and way more stance damage with this thing compared to the Shadow Sunflower Blossom with the same type of build. Now, it is gonna weigh a little bit more than the Shadow Sunflower Blossom, but the fact that you get it later in the game anyway, you should have put enough points into endurance to be able to wield this thing, and it's just going to be the much better option in my opinion. Number 10, the Duelist GREATAXE. Now, I'm going to be yapping about this weapon for a little bit because I have lots of opinions just to inevitably say that it's actually mid anyway, but this is an infusible Colossal weapon, does get the worst range in class, does get the highest base damage, and yes, even higher than the Giant Crusher. Now, it does get some of the worst scalings, so at these later levels, it is going to get outdamaged by a lot of different things, even like the GHIZA'S Greatsword, which is a Colossal sword, a weapon that's literally slower, is going to outdamage this one too. Now, this thing actually does scale better off dexterity than strength, but it has a 30 strength requirement, so you're going to spec into at least 20 of those things if you wanted to two-hand it just to maximize your damage. But if you're going to be two-handing the weapon, you're better off going with a strength build because you get 50% more to that stat and it's just going to make it do more damage. And another downside of this thing having a better dexterity scaling is that if you go to like elemental infusions or a bleed infusion, it's going to retain that dexterity scaling, so it definitely limits this weapon a lot. But the fact that it does have the highest base damage means that like earlier levels, it can just do more damage than some of the other ones. And it is going to be a lot lighter than things like the Giant Crusher with a lot lower of a strength requirement. Now, another downside is that it does get some of the worst stance damage. This thing gets 36 stance damage with its heavy attacks, which that is less than a hammer, less than a heavy thrusting sword, less than a great sword. It is just not good. So you might be wondering why this thing even gets to the B tier. And that's because it gets bonus damage on charged heavy attacks. Like, this thing gets really high amounts of motion values with its charged heavies, and it's to the point that it gets almost just as much damage as things like the Giant Crusher with a charged heavy attack, and it's going to do it in a faster animation. So you actually can pair this alongside a nice charged heavy attack build, and it can do pretty well. I kind of wish you could farm this weapon a lot earlier than you could, because you can only really farm it at Lendel. It would definitely give this weapon a lot more of a use, because the thing is not going to get that much less damage than the GHIZA'S Greatsword, but it is going to weigh less, and it is going to do much more damage on charged heavy attacks. So it could be a decent option up until you probably meet the requirements for things like the Giant Crusher, and then I'd probably just end up switching to that instead. Like, it's not a bad weapon by any means. I definitely think it should have had like a cool unique moveset like what the Duelists actually have, because this thing is just a basic generic Colossal weapon moveset. It would have been nice if it was a predominantly strength based weapon and not dexterity based. And I kind of wish I'd at least had 40 stance damage instead of 36. Like, at least put this thing in line with the Colossal swords instead of putting it in line with the great swords in terms of stance damage. But yeah, there's so many things that could have been changed about this weapon to make it better, but it's still not that bad at all. Number 9, the Anvil Hammer. Now, this weapon is quite literally the highest damaging weapon in the entire game. Does get a very good strength faith-based scaling, and the fact that it is classified as like somewhat of a smithing weapon, it actually does get a dexterity and intelligence scaling too. Only gets E-scalings in those stats, but if you're at these like max levels, literally nothing gets higher AR than the Anvil Hammer. Now the most amount of AR doesn't necessarily equate to the most amount of damage, because one, it is going to be doing split fire damage, and obviously just doing one damage type is almost always going to be better, especially if you're going to be fighting enemies that resist to fire damage, or if you're fighting in the rain. And also this weapon cannot be infused, so going with things like a Giant Crusher with things like Royal Knight Resolve or Cragblade, it's probably going to inevitably just make it do higher damage, but the fact that this thing does get amazing damage is not going to be a downside at all. Does also get the really good Colossal weapon stance damage across the board, does get decent damage with its heavy attacks. Now in terms of its skill, Smithing Art Spears, it is actually very nice, but unfortunately it is just outclassed by its heavy attack and guard counters in terms of damage and stance damage. Haven't really mentioned it much throughout the video, but Colossal weapons obviously get a really good guard counter. They're not going to be that slow, but they're obviously going to do amazing damage, amazing stance damage, and Colossal weapons are going to be pretty good at blocking, the Anvil Hammer being one of them. So going into either a heavy attack or a guard counter build can just be better. But the heavy attack does have some utility, as it does serve as an AoE, and it can go a bit further than like a regular attack. And also these spears that it actually does shoot out do piercing damage. So with this weapon, you actually get access to both piercing and striking damage, which is very unique. So if you are fighting like some smaller trash mobs in a group, or if you're fighting enemies weaker to piercing damage, this could be very useful. But in almost every instance, I'd rather just go with a charged heavy attack build, which typically are just gonna fare better with some other Colossal weapons. So the weapon is pretty great overall, but unfortunately the skill doesn't really offer much use. Number 8, the GHIZA'S will. There is not like a single weapon in the entire game that fluctuates from being one of the best to like one of the worst weapons. Like if you're looking at this gameplay, you're going to be questioning like, why the hell isn't this thing like such a high S tier? This thing should be number 1. Look at the damage that it's getting. And then you go ahead and look at another clip and you're going to be like, oh, it actually sucks. Because yeah, that's how inconsistent this weapon can perform. It just needs like a couple more things going for it, and then it could just straight up be like a very high S tier option. Now this weapon does get some of the most range in class, does only get a strength and dexterity based scaling, kind of scale split even in both. Cannot be infused, cannot be buffed. The weapon does get some split bleed, and it also has a heavy attack and a weapon skill that does spin the weapon around a whole bunch that can just proc bleed very quickly. Now the skill is just going to be like a short range like spinning effect, and the initial hits can like stagger enemies pretty well. It can do an okay amount of damage, can proc bleed at a decent rate. Now unfortunately this skill does not work with things like the multi-hit talismans, so the total damage is not going to be that amazing, and also the skill doesn't really get any hype Brahma, which is definitely a downside. Being that it's like a close range attack, you're just going to be staggered out of it very easily. And against larger bosses, the thing is just bugged as well. Like when you're fighting these slightly larger enemies, the weapon just spins like 3 times as slow, and your whole character just decides to like bug out and like move at like 2 FPS. And yeah, you're just missing out on so much more damage. Like if the skill got a bit more hype Brahma, actually wasn't bugged out against larger bosses, maybe worked with the multi-hit talismans, this thing could be amazing. But thankfully, its heavy attack makes up for it, because the heavy attack also spins around in one place. And thankfully, this attack does actually work with the multi-hit talismans, can just do way more damage, obviously not going to consume any FP, do more stance damage, and also proc bleed faster. Now this is only going to be true for the one-handed heavy attack. The two-handed heavy attack does not have this effect, as it does like swing to the side, where the one-handed heavy attack spins in that one place. And as you can see on screen, the damage can just be monstrous, like they can just melt so many different enemies. Now the inconsistency of this attack comes from the fact that some enemies might not be grounded, and when enemies aren't grounded, you're going to be missing out on a lot of the damage, because it only hits once with part of the blade. Because the blade spins like 4 times, it hits once beforehand and 3 times afterwards. And for some reason, if an enemy isn't grounded, it doesn't actually hit with the main part of the weapon, and that's the reason why it's missing out on so much more damage. Now in those instances to where you're fighting those bosses that have these weird hitboxes, and there's no part of their body on the ground for you to hit consistently, then you could just use like the regular light attack combos and it's going to perform pretty fine. You could also power stance it, because mainly you're just going to be using one-handed heavy attacks, so you could just do that. Could also pair it alongside the jellyfish shield too. There are many different ways that you can build around this weapon to make it more consistent. Now the fact that the weapon isn't going to get some of the most damage, and that power stance Colossal weapons aren't going to be that optimal either, it's not going to perform that well in these situations. And also another thing to note, this thing does get some of the worst stance damage as well. Like its light attacks and its heavy attacks gets like tied for the worst stance damage out of all the Colossals, which is perfectly fine if you're doing this much damage with the weapon. But yeah, that's basically my overall thoughts on it. It's just very inconsistent. Like there are plenty of bosses where this thing could just straight up just decimate them, and there are other times where you just wish you had anything else. Number 7, the ENVOY'S GREATHORN. Now this weapon is probably going to be your replacement of the ENVOY'S Longhorn. If you did want to have like a cool bubble type of build, this one is just going to be the better option now. Now no, it's not going to melt those larger bosses anywhere near as well as the old ENVOY'S Longhorn once did, but the skill in this bubble actually does go pretty far, does have some nice tracking, and it explodes in an AoE. So it's obviously going to be good at sniping bosses from a further distance, or going to be good at hitting smaller trash mobs that are all clumped up together. And it still only does consume that same 16 FP, and also consumes like next to no stamina as well. Like this thing is like a free attack almost every time. It does have a slightly longer animation, which does get a bit of hyper armor. I wouldn't recommend using it to trade out with bosses by any means, but that's kind of where the weapon does come into play, because weapon does get some pretty decent damage. It's mainly like a quality-based scaling, so therefore it's only getting a descaling in Faith, which unfortunately that's what the skill scales off. So if you wanted to maximize your damage of the skill, you're not going to really be getting as much weapon damage, which I guess is kind of like the major drawback of this weapon, and the reason why it's only going to get like a lower A tier. But with strength weapons or colossal weapons in general, you're just going to be two-handing them, of which you can just go into about 40 to 50 strength, meet like the soft caps, and just put the rest of your points into Faith. So at later levels, this can be like a very solid strength Faith-based option. And this skill is actually very underrated. It didn't really get much playtime beforehand, because one, it still is very annoying to farm, but the ENVOY'S Longhorn just outclassed it. But nowadays, with how more useful holy damage is, with its buffs and enemies weaker to it, and the ENVOY'S Longhorn nerf, I recommend giving this thing a shot. It's actually very good. Number 6, the WATCHDOG'S staff. Now this weapon is kind of cracked, I'm not gonna lie. This is a quality based colossal weapon, does get some decent damage, does get some decent range, cannot be buffed nor infused, so you are less limited to a quality based build, so you're not going to be able to really utilize spells, but that's still perfectly fine because this weapon's skill, Sorcery of the CROZIER, does work better than like almost every single spell projectile in this game, and it's just amazing and very easy to use while only consuming 15 FP. The skill just summons a bunch of these like magic projectiles, and these projectiles go pretty far, do some nice tracking, and best of all yet, are actually invisible to enemies. They don't like input read it, parry it, try to dodge it at all. They'll just like eat it to the face every single time. And the skill can be easily spammed, does about 12 stance damage, which isn't really anything amazing, but for a projectile attack, that's pretty decent. Now this weapon is going to come with some downsides. One, it does not get an intelligence scaling at all, therefore there's no way to improve the damage in terms of stats. So once you go to like later New Game Plus iterations, you kind of wish this thing at least had like a D or a C scaling in intelligence, so you could actually like further improve the damage. And also the skill is stuck on just like a regular generic colossal weapon with just average damage. So if you're not really too big of a fan of like the slow and sluggish colossal weapon moveset, you're probably not going to really like this weapon as much, but it definitely is deserving of an A tier purely because of its skill. Number 5, the PRELATE'S INFERNO CROZIER, which is definitely one of the heaviest and largest weapons in the entire game. Does get some of the most damage per hit in the entire game as well. Gets a very good strength scaling. Going with a heavy infusion is really good. Also going with an occult infusion is amazing too. It's one of like a few unique weapons that actually get a bunch of damage and really good scalings with an occult infusion, which typically you don't really care much to go with an occult infusion if you don't have a bleed based build, but with how good the scalings are, it's kind of the optimal pathing to like maximize damage. Now it's not the only weapon that can do this. Things like the Great Mace, Brick Hammer, and the Giant Crusher can also do this, and the Giant Crusher is probably just going to be the direct upgrade of this weapon. It does weigh a slight bit more, does get a slightly bit higher of a requirement, but it just does more damage across the board with every single type of infusion. And it also does get a faster and higher damaging heavy attack. So you might just think there's no reason for this weapon existing at all, but there are going to be a couple of things, and those one is going to be its heavy attack. It does get this like unique heavy attack that like it yeets and sends enemies flying into the air, which one, there aren't many heavy attacks that have like a special effect like this. So against all these smaller types of enemies, it can just straight up cheese them. Now against these larger enemies, I would still rather have the Giant Crusher, as that weapon is just going to hit a bit harder, do just as much stance damage, and actually be a bit faster. And also another thing, you can only get one Giant Crusher per playthrough. So if you actually wanted to go with something like insane, big bonking power stance jumping attack build, your offhand option is going to have to be the PRELATE'S INFERNO CROZIER. It is going to require a whole bunch of strength and a whole bunch of endurance, but it does have a use there as well. But yeah, if the Giant Crusher didn't exist, I would probably slide this thing into the S tier. But unfortunately, it's just a bit too similar to the Giant Crusher and just worse in a lot of different areas to warrant me wanting to put it into the S tier as well. Number 4, the Gazing Finger. Now this weapon is literally like one bug fix away from potentially being an S tier option, but as it stands right now, it's just going to be into the A tier. Now when the DLC first came out, I was not that big on this weapon at all, but I did just recently do a playthrough only using the weapon skill of this thing, and it is straight up just destroyed the entire game. This thing is actually really that good. Now this is a split magic damage in Colossal weapon, does get a lot more physical damage compared to that magic damage, does scale best of strength, but also does have an intelligence and faith based scaling. Now unfortunately, it's not going to be that amazing of like an int faith option, as it is only a D and an E scaling respectively. The weapon also does get the really good stance damage that the colossal weapons have with that 45 for every single charged heavy attack. And the weapon also has like the lowest stamina cost out of all the colossal weapons. Like across the board with every single attack, this thing just consumes the least amount of stamina, and it also is the lightest as well. And honestly, it doesn't really take damage as a trade-off either. Like the damage is still pretty decent. The weapon does get a unique heavy attack in this like cool downward slam, which does seem similar to things like the Bloodfiend's arm. Now, unfortunately, it is actually a little bit slower, and in fact, it's actually slower than a regular colossal weapon heavy attack. It's not that noticeable, but it still is a downside. Thankfully, it still does like the really high stance damage. But the best part about the weapon, and the main reason why it's going to get an A tier, is going to be because of its skill, Katawa's Resentment. For 31 FP, it slams the weapon down to the ground and it summons this like massive holy AoE attack. The skill actually can be fully charged for not that much longer of a charge time, and the AoE can just go so incredibly far, hit so many enemies at once. You can just clear out the entire room and do amazing damage, and all smaller enemies are going to get like tossed up into the air as well. So you can just like continuously stun lock them every time, and enemies don't actually react to it or try to dodge it either. Now, there are going to be a bunch of downsides as it does pertain to the skill. One, it is doing pure holy damage, which as I mentioned in the base game isn't going to be the greatest thing, but the fact that it's doing holy damage means that it's only going to pull off that faith scaling, and this thing gets an E scaling in faith, so it's not going to really benefit much by going into that faith stat. You're still going to get more damage out of the skill, but you're not going to really get that much more damage out of the weapon. So if you are building around this thing, this is technically going to be like a strength faith based option, which if you have been counting, that's literally 8 of the 20 colossal weapons that are strength faith based, which is actually kind of funny. Now, the reason why I say this weapon is bugged is because it currently doesn't work with the Shard of Alexander nor the Godfrey's icon. Like, this weapon is getting that much damage, and it doesn't work with these talismans. Like, this thing could be getting over 30% more damage if it could just work with these things. So hopefully From Software adds that in and fixes it, but I think that's kind of like the major reasons that's stopping me from putting it into the S tier. The fact that it's currently bugged, the fact that it only gets an E scaling in faith, and if you're actually going to spec into the skill, you're going to be wanting to use holy buffs, and if you're using holy buffs, you're not going to really benefit off weapon damage because the weapon is only physical and magic. It would have been nice if this skill actually did scale off both intelligence and faith. We're kind of left with this weird weapon that has a bunch of weird scalings, but thankfully the skill is actually top tier. Number 3, the FALLINGSTAR Beast Jaw. This weapon, it gets the most range in class by a considerable margin, and it also gets some very decent damage. Basically, is a quality-based weapon, does get a bit of an intelligence-based scaling, but you're mainly just going to be going into that strength and dexterity and just meet the requirements of intelligence. The weapon also does get piercing damage as well, which I always glaze as being the best damage type. Now, the weapon does get some split magic damage, so that piercing damage isn't really going to come into much effect, but it still is going to be a bonus because most of the damage is still piercing. So by itself, as a regular weapon, it's just already amazing. Like, it gets ridiculous range and does good damage, but its skill is also really good. Now, yes, people don't really use this weapon as much since it's been nerfed like years ago, but Gravity Bolt still is very decent. It's a very nice quick projectile attack that tracks right towards the enemies, so you don't really have to worry about enemies like animation reading or dodging all over the place that is going to get hit every time. It does it in a small AoE, doesn't consume much stamina, only 13 FP, and you can just spam it over and over again. This thing can like cheese and stun lock all smaller types of enemies. It could just be used as a nice way to just hit bosses at a further distance while they're trying to walk in towards you. Could also use it as a way to just stop enemies from regenerating poise as well. Like, the skill now only does about like 6 stance damage, where like it used to do like over 30 stance damage. So it's nowhere near as broken as it once was, and it probably did get nerfed a little bit too hard in that stance damage department, but it doesn't change the fact that it's still like an amazing weapon overall. Number 2, the Giant Crusher, which is like the biggest of bonks in the entire game. Out of all the infusible weapons in the game, this one just like hits the hardest per hit. So with all these different types of skills that the Giant Crusher can be equipped with, it's just going to make for the best pairing. Doesn't matter what it is. Lion's Claw, Eruption, Stamp, Upward Cut, whatever you want to use, the Giant's Crusher is probably just the best bet. Now, the downside is that it is going to weigh a whole bunch and have really high requirements, so it might only be like a good option for like later game, but it is just an amazing weapon. And since the DLC releasing, it's just only gotten better because of things like the two-handed talisman and the deflecting tier. Obviously, this thing is really good for those charged heavy attack builds because it does get that unique front flipping attack that just does amazing damage, really good stance damage. It can just destroy a whole bunch of things, but it also is one of the best weapons, if not the best weapon at blocking as well. This thing has really high guard boost, really high physical guarded damage negation, so it can pair nicely with its deflecting types of builds. And Colossal weapon guard counters are also very good. They're actually on the quicker end compared to some of the other strength-based weapon classes, but that is obviously going to be hitting way harder, and the Giant Crusher can just hit the hardest amongst them. So yes, thankfully, like, the biggest and most like brick looking weapon in the entire game is actually really good. And at number 1, the Bloodfiend's Arm. I'm sure to nobody's surprise, this weapon is probably the best weapon at charged heavy attacks, the best weapon with guard counters, and it's probably the best bleed weapon as well. As I've been mentioning with some of the Colossal weapons on this list, like with the Great Club and the Shadow Sunflower Blossom, it does get that really quick downward slam, which this attack is like literally faster than like some Greatsword or curved Greatsword heavy attacks, but it's just going to do like the damage of a Colossal weapon. And the Bloodfiend's Arm also gets like a follow-up AoE blood attack that just does bonus stance damage. And you compare this alongside Crackblade and you're like almost doing 60 stance damage for every single charged heavy attack. Like it's kind of just ridiculous. And also is really good at guard counters as well, because as I mentioned with the Giant Crusher, Colossal weapons just have a really good guard counter, and the Bloodfiend's Arm just gets like 50 stance damage for every single guard counter at that. Now the weapon actually doesn't get any passive bleed, but it does come with a split arcane scaling and that bleed based AoE heavy attack. So when going into a bleed infusion, it kind of doubles down into that arcane scaling, and you just get so much bleed that is like ridiculous, and every single one of these heavy attacks can like easily do over like 200 bleed per hit. And it just makes for a very stupid broken build, but even outside of a bleed build, it just performs the best too. Because going into these elemental infusions like a faith type of build with like a flame art or sacred infusion, going into the arcanes that actually boost the physical damage by a whole bunch, and it can just hit super hard. So like there's so many ways to build around the Bloodfiend's Arm, and every single build type is just going to be broken. Doesn't matter what you do, it's just the best Colossal weapon and one of the best weapons in the entire game. Okay, that is a list now done. That was a long one. This was definitely like the hardest like ranking list to make. I don't think it's going to be harder at this point. The Colossal weapons are just like so unique and different. Yeah, it is made for a big pain in the ass, honestly. So please definitely do like and subscribe. Now in terms of the next ranking, we're probably going to go over the spears, which there are going to be a lot of spears as well. So it might end up being another long video, but hopefully not as long as this one. And also do check me out on Twitch, because I am live there every single day doing a bunch of random challenge runs. So if that does interest you, definitely pop by. Anyway, I'll catch you guys around.